I still remember the moment my daughter's husband looked at me across that table and called me a beggar without saying the word directly. It wasn't loud, but it cut deeper than anything I had heard in years. In that instant, everything I had built, everything I had sacrificed, was reduced to what he thought he saw. And I realized something painful. Sometimes the people closest to you don't see you at all, until it is too late. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Hale, and at 67 years old, I have learned that the quietest lives often carry the heaviest stories. Every morning begins the same way in my small house near the Charleston Harbor. The air drifts in through the kitchen window, thick with salt and the distant scent of shrimp boats returning with their early catch. I wrap my fingers around a chipped ceramic mug and stand by the sink, watching the horizon slowly brighten. It is not a grand view, but it is honest, and that has always mattered more to me than beauty. My home is simple, almost plain to an outsider. The furniture is sturdy, worn from years of use, each piece chosen for purpose rather than appearance. There are no polished decorations, no expensive art on the walls. Just a few framed photographs, including one of my late husband, whose absence shaped more of my life than his presence ever did. When he passed, I did not have the luxury of falling apart. I had a daughter to raise and a future to build, and I learned quickly that grief could wait, but responsibility could not. I moved through my morning routine with quiet precision. My hands are not as strong as they once were, but they remain steady, trained by decades of work. There is comfort in repetition, in knowing exactly what the day will ask of me. It keeps the mind clear, the heart steady. Outside, my old pickup truck waits in the driveway, its paint faded and its body marked by time. I have had it for years, and like most things in my life, I have taken care of it so it would take care of me. People often judge a person by what they drive, but I have never seen the sense in replacing something that works simply to impress someone who does not matter. The neighborhood I live in is quiet, filled with people who mind their own business and do not ask unnecessary questions. To them, I am just another older woman living a modest life. I suppose that is exactly how I prefer it. There is a kind of freedom in being underestimated, in moving through the world without needing to prove anything. After getting dressed in my usual clothes, nothing fancy, just clean and practical, I head out into the morning. Charleston wakes slowly, its streets lined with grand homes and polished storefronts that speak loudly of wealth and status. I drive past them without a second glance. I have seen enough of that world to know that appearances rarely tell the full story. I make a quiet stop near one of my restaurants, though no one there would recognize me as anything more than a passerby. I watch from a distance, observing the rhythm of the kitchen, the way the staff moves, the small details that others often overlook. This has always been my way, present but unseen, involved without needing acknowledgement. My daughter Emily crosses my mind as I sit there for a moment longer than usual. She has built a life of her own now, one that should make me proud, and it does. But lately, there has been something else beneath her smile, something I cannot quite name. Since her marriage, I have sensed a shift, subtle but persistent. I cannot say exactly what is coming, only that something is. And after all these years, I have learned to trust that feeling. If you're still watching and starting to sense that something isn't quite right beneath the surface, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to what begins to change everything. That afternoon, when I returned home, the quiet inside the house felt different. It was not the peaceful kind I had grown used to over the years. It carried a weight, something subtle but persistent, like a thought that refused to fully form. I set my keys down on the small wooden table by the door and stood still for a moment, listening to nothing but the faint hum of the refrigerator. I had learned long ago to trust that kind of silence. The phone rang just as I was about to start preparing dinner. I already knew it was Emily before I even reached for it. A mother recognizes those things without needing proof. When I answered, her voice greeted me warmly, but there was something underneath it, something careful. She asked how I was, and I gave her the same answer I always did. Then she paused, just for a second longer than usual, before telling me she wanted to invite me to dinner later that week. The restaurant she mentioned was the Atlantic Crown, one of the most expensive places in Charleston, known for its polished floors, soft lighting, and clientele that measured worth in quiet glances and brand names. That alone told me this dinner was not her idea. Emily had never been one for formality, not with me. We had always preferred small cafes, places where conversation mattered more than appearances. So when she suggested a place like that, I understood immediately whose influence I was dealing with. She continued speaking, her tone gentle but deliberate. She said it would mean a lot if I dressed a little nicer than usual. The words were chosen carefully, almost as if she had practiced them. I did not feel offended, not exactly, but I felt the meaning behind them. My usual way of presenting myself did not fit into the world her husband was trying to build. I let her finish before responding. I told her I would come. There was another pause, longer this time. Then she added, almost reluctantly, that perhaps I should consider not driving my truck. She suggested I could take a taxi or let Daniel arrange something more appropriate. That was the moment the unease inside me settled into something clearer. It was not just about dinner. It was about adjustment, about expectation, about quietly asking me to become someone else for the sake of comfort that was not mine. I did not argue. I did not question her. I simply told her I would think about it. That seemed to relieve her, though I could still hear the tension she was trying to hide. We said our goodbyes, and the line went silent. I remained standing there, the phone still in my hand. For a long moment, I did nothing. I let the quiet return, but it no longer felt empty. It felt full of something I could not ignore. I walked to my bedroom and opened the closet. My clothes hung in neat order, simple, clean, each piece chosen because it lasted, not because it impressed. I selected the best of what I had, running my hand along the fabric as if it might tell me something. There was no resentment in me, only a quiet resistance. I would make the effort for my daughter, but I would not abandon who I was. As evening settled over Charleston, I stood by the window again, looking out toward the harbor. The same view I had that morning now felt different, touched by anticipation. This dinner was not going to be ordinary, and for the first time in a long while, I knew I would not be able to remain in the background. If you're still watching and feel the tension building before anything has even happened, comment number 2 below, so I know you're paying attention. Now, let's step into the moment where respect begins to crack. That evening arrived faster than I expected, as if the day itself was eager to push me toward something I could no longer avoid. I took my time getting ready, not because I was unsure, but because I understood what this dinner represented. I chose my best clothes, simple but well cared for, and stood for a moment in front of the mirror. I did not see someone out of place. I saw a woman who had lived her life on her own terms. When I stepped outside, the air had cooled, carrying the distant sound of waves brushing against the docks. My old pickup truck sat exactly where I had left it, unchanged and reliable. I placed my hand on the door for a brief second before getting in, fully aware that this choice, like many others, would be quietly judged. Still, I turned the key without hesitation. The Atlantic crown stood glowing under soft golden lights, its polished exterior reflecting a world that thrived on appearances. Expensive cars lined the entrance, each one a silent statement of status. My truck looked out of place among them, but I did not linger on that thought. I stepped out, closed the door, and walked inside. The interior was exactly as I expected. Marble floors, carefully arranged tables, and guests dressed as though they were part of a display rather than a meal. Conversations were low and measured, every movement controlled. It was a place designed to impress, not to comfort. I spotted Emily and Daniel already seated. Emily stood quickly when she saw me, her smile warm but slightly tense. She hugged me, holding on just a second longer than usual. Daniel rose more slowly, offering a polite greeting that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. We sat, and almost immediately, I felt the imbalance at the table. Daniel leaned back with ease, as though he belonged to the space in a way that others needed to earn. The waiter arrived, and without hesitation, Daniel took control of the interaction, selecting drinks and meals with practiced confidence. I let him proceed without interruption. At first, the conversation stayed on safe ground. Emily spoke about her work, about her students, trying to keep things light. Daniel listened, but it was clear he was waiting for his turn. When it came, he shifted the tone effortlessly, steering the discussion toward his career, his clients, and the importance of maintaining a certain image. I listened, not because I was impressed, but because I wanted to understand him fully. He spoke about ambition, about how success required visible proof. According to him, perception shaped opportunity, and those who failed to present themselves properly limited their own future. His words were polished, but the intention behind them was unmistakable. Then came the shift. He mentioned how some people chose to live below what they were capable of, as if comfort was a sign of weakness rather than wisdom. He did not look directly at me when he said it, but he did not need to. The meaning was clear enough. Emily tried to redirect the conversation, but her effort was soft, almost hesitant. I answered calmly, speaking about the value of reliability and purpose, but my words did not reach him. If anything, they encouraged him. His smile tightened slightly before he spoke again, this time with less subtlety. He described people who rejected status as individuals who settled for less, who lived without drive. Then, with a quiet certainty that made it worse, he referred to them as living like beggars by choice. The words settled between us, heavy and unmistakable. Emily reacted immediately, her discomfort visible, but she could not take the words back. I remained still, not out of shock, but out of clarity. In that moment, I understood exactly who Daniel was, and more importantly, what he valued. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I simply observed, and as I looked at my daughter, caught between silence and obligation, I realized this evening was no longer about me at all. If you're still watching, and that moment made you uncomfortable in a way you didn't expect, comment number 3 below to stay with me. Now, let's see how far this situation is about to go. The rest of the evening unfolded with a kind of careful tension that sat just beneath the surface of everything. The food arrived, beautifully arranged, each plate a small display of precision and effort. Under different circumstances, I might have appreciated it more. That night, it felt like decoration around something far less pleasant. I ate slowly, more out of habit than hunger. The flavors were rich, but they barely registered. Across from me, Emily tried to keep the conversation alive, asking about my day, mentioning small things from her work. Her voice carried a lightness that did not match her eyes. She was trying, but the effort showed. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed entirely at ease. If anything, he appeared more confident than before, as though crossing that earlier line had only confirmed something for him. He leaned back slightly in his chair, speaking with the same controlled tone, but now without the need to soften his words. He talked about independence, about how important it was for people to take care of themselves and not rely on others. His words were framed broadly, as general observations, but their direction was unmistakable. He spoke about success as something that had to be demonstrated, not assumed, and about how responsibility separated those who moved forward from those who stayed behind. I listened without interruption. Emily tried again to shift the conversation, mentioning a recent event at her school, but the moment passed quickly. Daniel returned to his line of thought, as though it were the only one that mattered. The balance at the table had already been lost. When the waiter returned with the dessert menu, there was a brief pause. It should have been a simple transition, a natural close to the meal. Instead, it became something else entirely. Daniel glanced at the menu, then set it aside without much interest. His attention shifted toward me, his expression calm, almost pleasant. Then, in a tone that suggested casual courtesy, he made his suggestion. He said that perhaps it would be a good opportunity for me to take care of the bill. He framed it lightly, as if it were a gesture of independence, something that aligned with the values I had mentioned earlier. The words were smooth, but the intention behind them was sharp and deliberate. Emily reacted immediately. Her posture changed, her voice quick as she tried to step in, reminding him that the dinner had been his invitation. There was a quiet urgency in her tone, the kind that comes from recognizing a mistake before it fully unfolds. Daniel dismissed her concern with a calm assurance, as though she were overreacting. To him, this was reasonable. To him, this was fair. I did not answer right away. I let the silence settle, not as resistance, but as thought. I looked at both of them, taking in the moment for what it truly was. This was not about the bill. It was about control, about defining a situation in a way that reinforced what he already believed. And then I agreed. My voice was steady, without hesitation or emphasis. The simplicity of it seemed to catch them both off guard. Daniel's expression shifted, just slightly, something like satisfaction passing across his face. Emily, however, grew more uneasy, her eyes searching mine as if trying to understand what I was thinking. But I offered no explanation. The conversation that followed was brief and hollow, filled with words that carried no weight. Everything now pointed toward the same moment, the one Daniel believed he had already shaped. When the waiter approached the table again, preparing to present the bill, I remained exactly as I had been all evening, calm, still, certain, because unlike the others at the table, I was not guessing what would happen next. If you're still watching and wondering how this situation could possibly turn around, comment number 4 below, so I know you're still here. Now let's witness the moment that changes everything. The air at the table had grown so still that even the smallest movement seemed to carry weight. I could feel Emily's unease beside me, the quiet tension in the way she held her hands together, as if bracing for something she could not yet see. Across from us, Daniel remained composed, his confidence intact, his assumption unchallenged. The waiter approached with measured steps, holding a small leather folder in his hand. Everything about the moment felt inevitable, as though it had been carefully arranged long before any of us had arrived. Daniel leaned back slightly, his attention fixed, waiting for confirmation of what he already believed. But the waiter did not place the bill on the table. Instead, he stopped just beside me and looked directly at me with recognition that was neither exaggerated nor uncertain. There was a brief pause, subtle but unmistakable, and then he spoke with quiet clarity. "Welcome back, Miss Hale. Your private table is ready, boss." The words settled into the space between us, soft in tone but impossible to ignore. I inclined my head slightly in acknowledgement, the gesture as natural as breathing. There was no need for surprise, no need for explanation. This was simply another part of my life, one that had never required announcement. For a moment, no one spoke. Daniel's expression shifted first into confusion, then disbelief. The confidence that had defined him throughout the evening faltered, replaced by something far less certain. He straightened in his chair, his eyes moving between the waiter and me, searching for a mistake that was not there. Emily's reaction was quieter, but just as telling. She looked at me with a kind of soft recognition, as though something long understood had finally taken visible form. There was relief in her eyes, but also something else, something closer to validation. The waiter remained still, waiting for my response with the same respect he would offer any returning owner. Around us, the atmosphere of the restaurant seemed to shift, subtle but undeniable. A manager approached not long after, greeting me with the kind of familiarity that left little room for doubt. I responded simply, thanking them and declining any special arrangements for the evening. There was no need to change anything now. The moment had already said more than words ever could. Across the table, Daniel struggled to find his voice. When he finally spoke, it came out uneven, his usual control replaced by uncertainty. He asked how this could be, how something like this had never been mentioned. I met his gaze without hesitation. "I never hid anything," I said calmly. "You just never asked." The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. It was not the silence of tension, but of realization. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly, as though trying to gather something that had already slipped away. The meaning of the evening had changed entirely. What had begun as a quiet test of my worth had turned into something else, something he had not anticipated. Not because I had corrected him, but because he had revealed himself fully before understanding who he was speaking to. The waiter remained nearby, still holding the bill. I reached for it without hesitation, not as an act of compliance, but as a simple conclusion. The gesture carried none of the weight Daniel had intended earlier. It was no longer a question of ability or proof. It was simply mine to take. When I handed it back, the table remained silent. Emily watched carefully. Daniel said nothing, and I felt no need to add anything further, because in that moment, everything that needed to be understood already had been. The silence that followed did not feel sharp anymore. It settled slowly, like something heavy finding its place after being suspended too long. I sat there without moving, aware of both of them across the table, but not needing to fill the space with words. Daniel looked different now. The certainty that had defined him earlier in the evening was gone, replaced by something far more uncertain. He shifted slightly in his seat, as though trying to find a position that felt natural again, but nothing seemed to fit. For a while, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its edge. It was quieter, almost careful, as if he were stepping into unfamiliar ground. He asked how it was possible, how something so significant had never come up before. There was no accusation in his tone this time, only confusion. I listened before answering, giving the moment the space it needed. "I never felt the need to mention it," I said. "It has never been the most important thing about me." The words were simple, but they carried everything I believed. I could see him trying to understand them, measuring them against the way he had always viewed the world. He leaned forward slightly, his attention focused now in a way it had not been earlier. There was no performance left in him, no need to impress, only a quiet attempt to make sense of something that did not align with his expectations. I thought about how much of my life had been shaped by necessity rather than choice. Building something from nothing had not been about ambition in the way he understood it. It had been about survival, about creating stability where there had been none. Over time, that work had grown into something larger, but the foundation had never changed. I built my business because I had to, I continued, not because I wanted to prove anything to anyone. Emily watched closely, her expression softer now, as though something inside her had eased. She had always understood me in ways that did not require explanation, but this was different. This was something she needed Daniel to see for himself. Daniel remained silent, but I could see the shift happening within him. It was not immediate, not complete, but it was there. The certainty he once relied on was no longer enough to hold everything together. He spoke again, more slowly this time, admitting that much of what he believed had been shaped by the world he worked in. Success in that world was something visible, something that needed to be demonstrated constantly. Without it, respect was uncertain. I nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in understanding. There is nothing wrong with ambition, I said, but when it depends only on what others see, it becomes fragile. He absorbed that quietly, without resistance. I did not need to say more than that. The rest was something he would have to work through on his own. The tension that had once filled the table had changed into something quieter, more reflective. Emily reached for her glass, her movements more relaxed now, as though she no longer felt the need to hold everything together. I looked at Daniel one last time, seeing not the man who had spoken earlier, but someone standing at the edge of a realization he had not expected. Respect, I thought, should never arrive only after the truth is revealed. And as the evening settled into its final moments, I knew that what had changed was not what I had shown them. It was what they had finally begun to see. If you're still watching and starting to see that something deeper is unfolding beneath the surface, comment number 6 below to let me know you're with me. Now let's move into chapter 7, where the consequences begin to settle. When I stepped outside the restaurant, the night air felt different from when I had arrived. It was cooler, quieter, untouched by the polished tension that had filled the dining room. The distant sound of the harbor carried softly through the streets, steady and familiar, reminding me that some things remained unchanged no matter what happened inside walls built for appearances. I did not wait for Emily or Daniel, not out of distance, but out of understanding. There are moments people must sit with on their own, and this was one of them. My truck stood where I had left it, unchanged among the rows of expensive cars that now seemed far less significant than they had earlier. I opened the door, settled into the seat, and sat for a moment before starting the engine. The silence inside the cab was honest, uncomplicated. It did not demand anything from me. As I drove through Charleston, the city seemed quieter than usual. The lights from the waterfront reflected off the water in long, wavering lines, and for a while, I let my thoughts follow them without direction. I replayed the evening in my mind, not searching for mistakes, but understanding what it had revealed. I did not feel satisfaction. What I felt was something closer to sadness, not for myself, but for Emily. She had been caught between two worlds, forced to navigate a space where respect had conditions attached to it. I had seen the way she struggled to hold things together, how her voice had softened, how her eyes had searched for something steady. No parent wants to see their child in that position. By the time I reached home, the weight of the evening had settled into something quieter. I turned off the engine and remained seated for a moment, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal. The house stood still in front of me, unchanged from the morning, as though nothing significant had happened at all. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it. I moved through the familiar space without turning on many lights, letting the dimness match the tone of my thoughts. I sat down near the window, looking out toward the same stretch of harbor I had watched that morning. The view had not changed, but I had. I found myself wondering whether I should have handled things differently. Perhaps I could have told Daniel the truth earlier, spared Emily the discomfort of that evening. It would have been easier, cleaner, less painful, but I knew, even as the thought formed, that it would not have made a difference. Some lessons cannot be given. They have to be lived. Daniel had not needed information. He had needed perspective, and that is something no one can hand to another person without experience. Somewhere else in the city, I imagined Emily and Daniel facing what had happened. I could see the conversation without hearing it, the quiet disappointment in her voice, the absence of defense in his. I did not need to be there to understand it. For the first time since I had known him, Daniel had been forced to look beyond what he believed defined success. Whether he would accept that or resist it, I did not know. I did not feel anger toward him. What he had done was not new. I had been underestimated before, judged by things that never mattered. The difference this time was not the judgment itself, but who it affected. I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet settle fully around me. The evening had not ended with resolution, but something had shifted, and sometimes that is where change begins. A few days passed before anything changed, and in that time I returned to the rhythm of my usual life. The mornings came quietly, just as they always had, and the harbor carried on without concern for what had unfolded inside a polished dining room. There was comfort in that consistency, in knowing that not everything shifted when people did. I had just finished reviewing a few notes at the kitchen table when I heard a knock at the door. It was not hurried or forceful, just steady, as though whoever stood outside had taken time to consider whether they should be there at all. When I opened it, Daniel stood on the porch. He looked different, not in a way that could be measured by clothing or posture alone, but in something quieter. The certainty he once carried was gone, replaced by a kind of hesitation that did not sit easily on him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked if we could talk. I stepped aside and let him in. He moved carefully through the house, his eyes taking in the space without judgment this time. There was no trace of the quiet evaluation I had seen before. Instead, there was attention, as though he were seeing things he had overlooked entirely. We sat across from each other, the same table where I had spent so many ordinary mornings. This moment did not feel ordinary. He did not begin right away. His hands rested still, his gaze shifting briefly before settling again. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked the polished confidence I had grown used to hearing. He said he was sorry. Not in a way that felt practiced or convenient, but in a way that carried weight. He spoke about the things he had said, but more importantly, about how he had thought. He admitted that his assumptions had shaped everything, that he had measured me against a standard he had never questioned. I listened without interruption. He went on, explaining that much of his perspective had come from the world he worked in, a place where appearance mattered as much as substance, where success needed to be visible to be believed. Over time, he had stopped separating what was expected from what was true. Then he said something that seemed harder for him to admit. He told me that part of his behavior had come from jealousy, not of money or position, but of something less tangible. The way Emily spoke about me, the respect she carried without effort. He had felt the need to measure himself against that, to prove that he belonged in a way he did not fully believe. There was no defense in his words, only acknowledgement. When he finished, the room was quiet again, but it was not the same kind of silence as before. It felt open, not heavy. I told him that understanding why something happens is often more important than trying to undo it. People do not change because they are told to. They change when they see clearly enough to want something different. He listened, this time without searching for a response. I also admitted that I had made my own assumptions about him. It would have been easy to see only what he showed at the restaurant, to define him by that moment alone. But people are rarely as simple as they appear, especially when they are still figuring themselves out. The tension between us softened, not completely gone, but no longer defining the space. Before he left, I invited him and Emily to dinner at my house that weekend. It was not a grand gesture, just an open door. He accepted with a quiet gratitude that did not need emphasis. When he stepped outside, I watched him walk back down the path, his pace slower, more deliberate. Something in him had changed, not finished, but begun. If you're still watching and feel that something meaningful is about to come full circle, comment number 8 below, so I know you're ready. Now, let's move into the final outcome of this story. The evening they came to my house felt different from the moment I began preparing for it. There was no tension in the air, no quiet sense of something waiting to unfold. Instead, there was a steadiness I had not felt in days, a kind of calm that came from knowing exactly where I stood. I started cooking earlier than necessary, not because the meal required it, but because I wanted the time. The kitchen had always been the place where my thoughts settled, where everything made sense in its own quiet way. The rhythm of chopping, seasoning, and preparing each dish brought me back to something familiar, something real. The menu was simple, nothing extravagant, nothing meant to impress, just food made with care, the way I had always done it, the kind of meal that did not need explanation. When I heard the knock at the door, I wiped my hands and walked over, already knowing what I would see. Emily stood there first, her expression open and warm, the tension that had once followed her now gone. Daniel stood beside her, quieter, more reserved, but present in a way I had not seen before. I welcomed them in without hesitation. They stepped into the house as though entering a space they had never truly noticed before. Emily moved easily, familiar with every corner. Daniel, however, looked around with a kind of quiet attention, not evaluating, not comparing, but observing. We settled into the evening naturally. There was no need to fill the silence with unnecessary words. The conversation unfolded on its own, moving from small details to shared memories. Emily spoke freely, her voice no longer carrying the strain it once had. Daniel listened. That was the first thing I noticed. He did not interrupt, did not redirect, did not shape the conversation to fit himself. Instead, he allowed it to move, asking questions when they mattered, responding with thought rather than reflex. It was a small change, but it carried more weight than anything he had said before. As we sat down to eat, the difference between this table and the one from the restaurant became clear. There was no performance here, no quiet competition beneath the surface, just 3 people sharing a meal. At one point, Daniel spoke about his work, but the tone had shifted. He no longer spoke in terms of image or recognition. Instead, he described the process, the challenges, the decisions that mattered beyond what others could see. It was the first time I had heard him speak without trying to prove something. Emily listened with a quiet pride, her expression soft, as though she recognized something she had been waiting for. Later, Daniel turned his attention toward me. He spoke carefully, not with hesitation, but with intention. He acknowledged what he had come to understand, not about what I had built, but about how I had built it. the discipline, the patience, the consistency, the things that could not be displayed, only lived. I accepted his words without deflecting them. There was no need to diminish what had been said, just as there had never been a need to declare it in the first place. As the evening continued, the atmosphere grew lighter. There were moments of shared laughter, small stories from the past that carried warmth rather than tension. Emily leaned back in her chair, relaxed in a way I had not seen in some time. When the plates were cleared and the house settled into its usual quiet, we remained seated for a while longer. No one felt the need to rush away. I looked at them both, seeing not what had been broken, but what had begun to mend. And I realized then that the most meaningful things in life were never the ones people tried to show. They were the ones that quietly remained. After they left that night, the house returned to its familiar quiet, the kind that settles gently rather than presses in. I did not rush to clean or move things back into place. Instead, I stood for a while in the stillness, letting the evening rest exactly as it was. Some moments deserve to linger. I eventually made my way to the kitchen, clearing the table slowly, not out of necessity, but out of habit. The small details of the evening stayed with me, not the words, but the way they had been spoken, the pauses, the shifts, the things that could not be forced, only recognized. Daniel had changed. Not completely, not in a way that could be measured or declared, but in a way that mattered. I had seen it in the way he listened, in the absence of that quiet need to prove something. There was space in him now, where before there had only been certainty, and sometimes that is where understanding begins. Emily too seemed lighter. The strain I had noticed before had softened, replaced by something steadier. She was no longer balancing two opposing worlds. She was simply present, as she had always been meant to be. I carried a plate to the sink and paused, looking out the window toward the harbor. The water moved the same way it always had, steady and unchanged. It reminded me of something I had known for most of my life but had never needed to explain. People see what they expect to see. For Daniel, I had been defined before I ever spoke. My clothes, my home, my truck. They had told him everything he thought he needed to know. And because of that, he never looked further. But that is not unique to him. It is something many people do, measuring worth by what is visible, by what can be displayed and recognized quickly. It is easier that way, simpler, but it is also incomplete. I never chose a simple life because I had less. I chose it because I understood what mattered. There are things that cannot be shown in a glance: stability, integrity, the quiet work of building something that lasts, the patience it takes to hold on to what is real, even when the world rewards something else. Those things do not announce themselves. They remain. I turned off the light and stood by the window one last time, watching the faint reflection of the city across the water. Nothing about the view had changed since that morning, and yet it felt different. Not because the world was new, but because it had been seen more clearly. And in the end, I knew this much to be true. A person is not defined by what others think they see, only by what they choose to be, day after day. In the end, what truly matters is rarely what can be seen at a glance. The world often teaches us to measure worth through appearance, status, and outward success, but those things are fleeting, shaped by perception rather than truth. Real value is built quietly over time, through consistency, integrity, and the way we choose to treat others when there is nothing to gain. Growth does not come from being proven wrong, but from being willing to see differently. And sometimes, the most powerful lessons are not taught through words, but through moments that challenge everything we thought we understood. If this story made you reflect in any way, take a moment to share your thoughts below. Your perspective matters. And if you enjoy meaningful stories like this, do not forget to follow and subscribe for more.